Hello and welcome to another session of Hermeneutics. This is session number 7, and we are going to be intentionally diving into specific genres, starting with the Old Testament. And this month, we're going to be looking at how to read the narrative portions of the Old Testament. So if you're following along in the textbook, this is chapter 9. This is the first part of chapter 9, because chapter 9 is going to go through a variety of Old Testament genres. And we've moved past, I think, going through the kind of bird's eye view and the summaries and the overviews of basic interpretive methods. And now we're looking very, very specifically on how to look at the individual genres of the Old Testament. And interestingly enough, narrative is actually the largest section of uh, genre within the entire Bible, actually, not just the Old Testament. And so I think this is appropriate to begin with looking at narrative, and we're going to see that there are a variety of sub-genres in narrative. And if you've been reading the Bible for a while, I think that you'll be nodding your head as we go through this session, as we look at the various ways in which narrative kind of breaks down into these different sections and how to read them, and the sort of strategies that I'm going to recommend that we have in our mind as we approach these, and we can try to interpret them with a lot more success at getting at what the original authors were trying to convey to their original readers. So nothing outlandish or crazy today. We're just looking at some basic narrative in the Old Testament and seeing how we're supposed to be reading it responsibly. So without further ado, we will begin our study. Okay. And we are going to swap this. Okay. I think we are looking at what we need to look at right now. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, the topic for this session is how to read Old Testament narrative. That's not aught narrative. That's just the Old Testament narrative. And I just picked a narrative picture of Abraham with a bunch of sheep in the background, and hopefully we see ourselves as sheep of the Good Shepherd. So let's just kind of begin, because we got a lot of content to cover. And if I had more time, I would love to just really just dig into a lot of these passages and actually read them and talk about them and examine them. But that would take, 18 hours to do. So I'm intentionally packing a lot into this presentation, and you can go back and look at a lot of passages. And one of the ways that I think you'll get the most out of this particular teaching is to pause it as you're going back and watching it, and go through and read the passages and see if you can put into practice the interpretive tips that we are going to supply for each of the subgenres of Old Testament narrative. So let's begin with some of the basics. Old Testament narrative, narrative in the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament narrative sections are the most common literature of the Bible. So 40% of the Old Testament is narrative, and actually that would be considered 31% of the entire Bible if we take into account that the Old Testament is 77% of the entire Protestant Bible. When I say Bible, I mean the Protestant Bible, because I know that we've talked about various Bibles, depending on how many books are in your Bible. I'm comfortable using the Protestant Bible with 66 books. That's plenty of books for me. I don't need any more books. So I have enough trouble as it is keeping track of the contents of those 66 books. So obviously, narrative is a major section, and so we need to spend a lot of time looking into it. Now, the genre contains several key literary devices that we should be aware of. And so we're just going to kind of knock these out fairly quickly. But I think this helps us to see the sort of sophistication that we should have when we are reading the various narrative sections. So they're going to have a plot, they're going to have an overarching story that the author is trying to convey to his audience. And of course, that plot has to fit into the larger plot of the entire book. Okay. There's going to be characterization. We're obviously going to have the perspective of the main character and his or her family members. They're usually antagonists. Sometimes there are people that appear to him, whether it's an angel or God. but you have characters in the story. That's just part of a plot. Descriptions describing a person, what they're doing, where they're going, a particular city, what they're actually trying to accomplish, and we want to take those seriously. The style of the piece of narrative, and we're going to look at different ways in which that's broken down throughout this particular teaching. The narrative pacing, that actually is very, very interesting. Is it going to start off by talking about a few years have gone by, and then we're going to look at a particular episode? Is it going to talk about how someone sleeps and they wake up, or that's been 7 years and then this encounter took place? The pacing of a story, of course, is part of telling that particular story, even if it begins with something like a long, long time ago in a galaxy far away. The point of view, that's also important to consider. You have the stories that are typically told in the third person. This is what Abraham did. This is what Isaac did. This is what Moses did. They're usually told in the third person. But sometimes we're going to get narratives that are actually told from the first person. Those are comparatively fairly rare, but we get that particular point of view, but also understand that you're getting the point of view of what the author is trying to say as well. So the author is making sure that the stories are framed in his words. We've talked about word plays before, which are often difficult to bring over into an English translation. Sometimes we'll have good footnotes that'll point that out to you, or if you have a good study Bible, the study Bibles will, of course, point out the word plays that are significant to the meaning of a particular passage. But those do appear in narrative sections. We really should stop thinking that the narrative sections are just the easiest and just the plainest to read, to where we just kind of read them as literally as possible. There's often a lot more nuance that is taking place in narrative. The intentional repetition of words. If you see a word getting repeated over and over again, that is almost certainly something that is deliberately being emphasized by the author, and we should take that very seriously. Uh, for example, when Paul in 1 Corinthians is going to repeat calling the recipients brothers or brothers and sisters, family members, then that, of course, is an emphasis that's there. I think that word, that noun brothers, appears in 1 Corinthians more than any other book in the New Testament, which makes sense because Paul is trying to tell them that despite all the fighting and differences and conflicts that are going on in 1 Corinthians, they are still a part of the same family. And so the repetition of words are typically not an accident. And the inclusion or the exclusion of key details. And so you'll have to use your best judgment to kind of see what actually is a detail that is key. And of course, if you're assuming that a key detail is being excluded, then if you're right about that, then that, of course, is something that's important to the author. Okay, so the first subgenre within Old Testament narratives that we're going to look at are reports. And even within reports, there are a variety of subgenres. So subgenres, or excuse me, reports, they are the simplest biblical narrative that we're going to find. What is a report? Well, a report is a brief, self-contained narration, usually in third-person style, about a single event or situation in the past. Of course, when you are reporting something, you're reporting something that has taken place. They're not reporting something that's taken place in the present. They're reporting something that has taken place already. And they can be broken down into individual units that are worth studying. And again, I'm getting all of these out of the textbook. I'm supplying some additional information from my own study and from other works that I actually have available to me. But you're getting, I would say, if you've read the chapter, you are getting about 80% of what you've already read. So an anecdote, just like we use the term today, that's an event or an experience in the life of a person that's kind of like a private biography rather than a public history. So we have examples of this in First Kings, or a couple of them here, and they're telling the private story, the private experience, something that happened privately, rather than just the public history of what a particular king or a particular prophet actually did. And so this is, of course, a report of something that's a little bit more personal. Okay. A battle report, another part of Old Testament narrative, recounts the military clash and, of course, its results. And a battle report typically is going to indicate whether the battle ended in victory or defeat. You're, of course, going to get a lot of these in Numbers and in Joshua, but there are a lot of battles between the judges um, in the book of Judges. And, of course, 2 Samuel, dealing with the life of David, is going to have a variety of those. And so you'll have the good guys and the bad guys, depending on your point of view. And that, of course, is a piece of narrative. But the report of the particular battle, the skirmish, the war, is its own subgenre within the reports. A construction report, as you might surmise, retells the building of important structures or objects. It'll talk about the size, the materials involved, and the decoration, and all those facets are detailed within the report of the construction. So in Exodus chapter 36, going for really 3 chapters, 36, 37, 38, you're going to have the report of the tabernacle, which is the predecessor to the Jerusalem temple. And then, of course, in First Kings, you're going to actually get the description of the physical temple. That's Solomon's temple. So you can see those are lengthy reports spanning multiple chapters. Okay. Still under reports, a dream report. This is where a dream is going to be recounted in the first or in the third person. It could be that this dream or experience happened to this person, or it could be that the perspective is being told from a first person perspective. So you will note that the verb to dream, or even the verb behold, is going to appear in these particular dream reports. So whenever you see those things, then you can be alerted to the fact that you are probably reading a dream report. Okay. There's going to be shifts in the report, of course, especially with behold. Like this happened, and then behold, that means something important is taking place that is kind of changing or shifting the emphasis in the dream report. And they are frequently followed by a particular scene in which the dream is interpreted. So you'll actually have the dream and you'll have the interpretation of the dream. And whenever the dream is not interpreted, then of course the author is assuming you're able to figure that stuff out for itself. Whenever the dream is interpreted, whatever interpretation is given, that is the interpretation of the dream. And you better make sure that your interpretation lines up with the interpretation that is given to the reader. So you'll have a variety of these in Genesis, as you'll see, but also you'll see it appears in the book of Judges as well. So that is fairly interesting. Now, an epiphany report is similar to a dream, but this is going to recount an experience in which God shows up, or it's an angel of God showing up to a particular person. Okay. So some people will call this just an appearance of God. And why would God or an angel of God show up to a particular person? Well, that means that it's occurring in which there's a time to where God wants to tell that person something, wants to convey a message. Whenever an angel appears to somebody, it's usually to convey a message, because that's what an angel is. An angel is a heavenly messenger. And the reports are often characterized by the verb to appear, which also could be translated as to become visible. And so in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7, it says that the Lord appeared to Abraham and told him that he's going to receive all of this land. And so you could see that this happens at a variety of times. God appears to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whether it's God or it's an angel of God actually is an open question. And I tend to think that more often than not, when these people are encountering God, they're actually encountering God's angel. And of course, through the principle of agency, to encounter an angel effectively means you're encountering God. So there's really not much of a difference there. Obviously, in Exodus chapter 3, that's the burning bush where an angel of Yahweh appears in the bush to Moses. But it also appears in Judges and First Kings this happens quite often, angels appearing. That's pretty common in Old Testament narrative. And it's possible for an epiphany report to be combined with a dream report, because sometimes in a dream, God will appear to somebody in a dream, or an angel will appear to somebody in a dream. We can see that in Genesis 28 with Jacob and Jacob's ladder. And then surprisingly, with Joseph in the New Testament, in Matthew's gospel, an angel appears to him in a dream. So you can see that these aren't strict categories that are always differentiated. Sometimes they kind of flow together, and the author is more than capable of combining them if he wishes to do so. Okay, historical stories. These are reports that are longer than these kind of smaller reports. They have a lot more literary elaboration than the basic reports. And these historical stories will develop plot. They will record dialogue and speeches. And most importantly, this is the most important part of the historical stories, they will include dramatic literary elements. Okay. So there are a variety of these in the Deuteronomistic history, as we've talked about before. That's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And typically, you can see these are longer stories. Judges chapter 9, 1 Samuel chapter 11, 1 Kings chapter 12. And again, they're longer, but they have some sort of dramatic, important, significant literary element within it that makes it rather interesting. So we can see there with reports, there are a lot of different types of reports, and you probably could have read through a variety of reports. If I was to give you a bunch of passages that can contain each of those, you probably could have made those distinctions by yourself. Okay, so what are some tips? What are some principles for interpreting Old Testament narrative reports? Number one, you should focus on the main subject that's being recounted in the report and how that main subject contributes to the themes of the wider context of the story. Okay. So if we're reading individual reports, we need to ask, okay, well, how does the main subject of this report fit into the wider context of the book? So if we're reading something in Genesis 28, how does this fit into the larger themes of the entire book of Genesis? That's something that readers typically have a hard time doing, because it forces them to look at something small and then to ask the question, okay, how does this piece of the puzzle help move the larger story from one point to another? And that, of course, requires you to have a pretty good grasp of what that wider story has been. This is why I really discourage people just kind of jumping into the Bible and just kind of, just kind of taking it and flipping through and like, okay, I'm going to start reading this particular passage. You have to kind of start from the beginning and see how the author is going to develop a particular story. And that way you're reading everything in context. So the author of Genesis, or at least the person that compiled all of it, did not expect you to jump into chapter 28 without reading chapters 1 through 27, or at least as we know them. Don't expect devotional material to be intended by the author. Instead, we should take seriously the facts that are presented, namely what occurred, who did what, etc. I actually find it hard sometimes to really pull out devotional material from the Old Testament. I know that it's scripture and inspired, and it can be used for our learning, and we can obviously learn the faithful things that we're supposed to be doing, and we can see how God has been working with people in history. We can see how God has been orchestrating and organizing his people. We can see the sort of behaviors we're not supposed to do. But when you are reading reports, they're not intended for you to apply them to your life. That's not their function and their intention. So don't expect it to be there. Okay. Obviously, not all parts of the Bible are going to be as applicable as Sermon on the Mount. Okay. Number three, carefully consider what the author is conveying indirectly with the report. Okay. So look for some subtle signals that are woven into the account that affect the wider story being told by the author. Okay. This could be things that are not explicitly stated, but are fairly obvious to you as the reader. Things that you expect a particular person to do, but he's not doing. things that have already been foreshadowed, if they're lying or if they're following in the behavior of someone that has gone before them. So don't just look at the things that are explicitly there. Be able to discern if the author is indirectly saying something as well, because that occurs. Again, it's not just what's said, but also what is not said. All right. And number 4, analyze the emphases that the individual reports have in common. Okay. So if you're reading multiple reports in a particular chapter or in a particular book, what do they have in common? What are their common themes? Consider also what message these emphases would give to the original readers in their own time period, not the specific time being narrated. That is really, really important. Okay. So we talked about that when we were going through the book of Daniel. We talked about how the book of Daniel is describing the events in the 6th century, but it was actually written in the 2nd century BC. And so I was constantly asking, okay, what did this mean for its original audience? Before I would ask the question, what does it mean for us today? So the time period that's actually being narrated is not always going to be the time period in which the author is actually writing the book. In fact, most of the books of the Old Testament, since we're talking about Old Testament narrative and Old Testament literary genres, most of those books are written quite a long time after the events that they're actually talking about. Okay. Genesis is written quite a long time after the events that are recorded in Genesis chapter 1, obviously. So, and that's something that gets overlooked, I think, by a lot of readers and takes a lot of nuance, but it's also something that's really, really important. Okay. All right. So that's enough about reports. What about heroic narratives? Hero narratives. Okay. So this sort of narrative contains multiple episodes that focus on the life and the exploits of a hero who the author considers relevant enough to recount. Okay. Uh, Ignore my comma there. Okay. So we have a hero, and he is heroic enough that the author thought it was worthy enough to tell us a little bit about his particular story. So these episodes, and there are multiple episodes in a heroic narrative, often contain accounts of the hero's birth, their marriage, who they're married to, their life, what they actually do for work, and of course, their death. And the heroism and the virtue of the subject are also stressed. Okay. They're not just casually mentioned, they're going to be emphasized. Okay. They are a hero because they do heroic, brave things. Okay. They demonstrate faithfulness in spite of conflict or antagonist or threats against their life. They demonstrate virtuous behavior even when they're surrounded by sinful people. Okay. Uh, the positive and the negative examples of the hero's life are intended to offer lessons to the reader. Okay. So you can look at the life of Moses, which of course is going to be covered in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Moses did some good things. That is true. But Moses did some things that are not so good. I mean, he did, you know, kill some people. He was disobedient. And, so there are some things about Moses' life that are worth emulating, and there are some things in Moses' life that are not worth emulating. Okay. Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, they have multiple chapters that are given to them. And you can see that's kind of the length. A heroic narrative is not just going to be a small little report that covers 5 or 6 verses. It's going to cover multiple chapters. And of course, in the case of Moses, I think his is the longest heroic narrative, even longer than David, I think. Yeah, certainly longer than David. David would be probably the second longest heroic narrative. But you get the sense that there's going to be multiple stories. I mean, in Samson's life, you got multiple stories. Some of them indicate times when he was faithful. Some of them indicate times when he was unfaithful. Okay. A sub-variety of the heroic narrative is the epic. Okay. If you're familiar with an ancient piece of literature called the Epic of Gilgamesh, then you are familiar with another piece of ancient epic. Okay. They are longer and they focus on the magnification of the hero's exploits in greater detail. And they are often, as I tend to find, going to possess strong nationalistic interest. Okay. How does this hero's exploits focus on the kingdom of Israel? How does it focus on the kingdom of God? How does it focus on developing the land or the conquest of the land? Something like that. Okay. So that's part of the emphases within an epic. Okay. So Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the textbook says that this is going to be a cosmic epic. Okay, so covering 11 chapters, and it's going to describe the formation of the entire cosmos, and of course the human inhabitants of the cosmos. Okay, so of course that deals with the fact that all the earth is supposed to be ruled over and subdued by humanity, but they get kicked out of Eden, and it's ultimately leading up to the fact that Abraham is going to inherit that land. That's kind of the cliffhanger at the end of chapter 11, and it gets picked up in chapter 12. So, of course, chapter 12 through 36 is going to be an ancestral epic, which is going to describe the lives and also the promises that are made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, and he has his 12 sons. And so, if you're looking at that, you're thinking, okay, well, that's Genesis 1 through 11, and then it's 12 through 36. What about 37 through 50? What about that? We'll get to that. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it'll be interesting if you kind of remember that, okay, if there are two massive epics in Genesis, what is going on for the final, how many chapters that is? 37 through 50. What is that? 14 chapters? Yeah. We'll get to that. That's interesting. Okay, but you can see epics are obviously much, much longer than 2 chapters dedicated to Deborah, 3 chapters dedicated to Gideon, 4 chapters dedicated to Samson. Okay, again, Moses is kind of the exception to it. Okay, so hero narratives and of course epics are related to that. And of course, Genesis 12 through 36 is going to deal with several different heroes there. And of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're not perfect. They're not sinless. They do some good things. They do some not so good things. That much is clear. Okay. Let's talk about the prophet story. Okay. And as you might surmise, the prophet story is going to deal with the life of a prophet. What's a prophet? Prophet is any person who speaks on behalf of God. Okay. Not all prophets are literary prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. There are non-literary prophets like Moses, Elijah, Elisha, Nathan. So a prophet story recounts the life of a prophetic figure, particularly one whose life is virtuous and whose message is relevant to the wider story in which the author and the readers are living. That's the key thing, okay? A prophet is only a prophet because they are speaking and conveying a message that God wants them to say. It's the message that's really important. They're just kind of the vessel that's speaking. They're just the mouthpiece, okay? But it's the relevancy of the message that God is speaking through them, especially to the wider story and the larger purposes of the book as a whole. And of course, those books were written to a particular audience, so they're relevant to the readers, the original readers. Okay? So prophet stories are going to focus on the lives of particular prophets. Okay? The aim or the function of a prophet story is to edify the reader by presenting the prophet as a model of proper conduct. Okay? So I'm going to say that's the first and primary aim. The second aim of this narrative story is to discredit the larger political and or religious system. Often political and religious go together. So to discredit that larger system, which Yahweh is rebuking through the message of the prophet. Okay. So notice you have kind of a positive purpose of a prophet story, which is to kind of highlight the virtue of this spokesperson, their behavior, their conduct, but also there's a negative point in which it's trying to rebuke or to discredit a religious system against which the prophet is speaking, or a political system against which the prophet is speaking. And again, in our culture, we tend to separate religion and politics, at least over here in the West, but in the ancient Near East and in the Bible, things that are religious are often political as well. So the kingdom of God is a political entity and a religious entity, and you cannot separate the two. Okay, so examples of prophet stories would include the lives of Elijah and Elisha. Okay, so that, of course, is going to be from Elijah. It's going to go from 1 Kings chapter 17 all the way through 2 Kings chapter 9. And the reason for that is that 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one entire document, but they don't fit on one scroll, so it got kind of cut up. And so now you have 1st and 2nd Kings. So the cutting in the narrative between 1st and 2nd Kings is really arbitrary. There's nothing special about it. So it's no surprise that his story is going to go bleed into 2nd Kings. And then, of course, 2nd Kings chapter 13 is going to deal with the life of Elisha. You have Daniel, of course, who is a prophetic figure in a variety of ways. He is dealt with in Daniel chapters 1 through 2 and 4 through 6. Chapter 3, of course, deals with Daniel's three friends, who we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay. And then Jonah. Okay. In all four chapters of Jonah, Jonah only has four chapters. So Jonah chapters 1 through 4, that deals with the prophet life of Jonah. That's really interesting. So lots of these sort of prophet stories. And again, you could see Elijah and Elisha, those are non-literary prophets. And as you know from the New Testament, Elijah is considered to be kind of the premier person that kind of identifies the prophets and the phrase law and prophets. You've got Moses and Elijah. So you don't have to be a literary prophet to be significant. Okay. Prophet stories regularly contain retellings of miracles that take place and acts of faithful bravery. So this is just kind of a common theme that you're going to see. Prophets not only speak forth the words of God, but they can also perform miracles. Okay. If you read through the lives of Elijah and Elisha, it's very interesting to compare the miracles that they are able to perform with, of course, the empowerment of God working through these prophets. If you compare those to the miracles that Jesus performs, it's interesting that Jesus is kind of being portrayed as a prophet like Elijah or a prophet like Elisha, because those figures performed the same miracles earlier. And of course, they demonstrate bravery as they are speaking forth the message, usually towards an unfaithful king or to an unfaithful nation. Okay, so narratives and prophet stories kind of go together when we talk about the tips or the principles for interpreting them. So that's this particular slide. So number one, the interpreter needs to focus on the life of the main character, okay? Whether that character is a single person, whether it's a family, or whether it's an entire nation, okay? So in doing so, it's important to ask how the hero is portraying a righteous relationship with God, okay? So when you're looking at Abraham, God says, okay, I want you to go and I want you to do this. Okay, so he's obeying, he's leaving his family, he's leaving his land, he's leaving behind all that stuff right there. But that's different than how God is talking to Elijah. Okay, but again, you want to focus on the main character, even though there are a variety of other people that are being described in that story. Hero narratives are narratives about the hero. Prophet stories are focusing on the lives of the particular prophet. Okay, yes, there are other people that are involved, but focus on the main person, focus on the protagonist. Okay. As you're doing this, ask yourself, we were talking about this. So ask what worldviews belonging to the original reader are being intentionally discredited. Okay. So this, again, you have to discern, and good study Bibles and good commentaries will point this out to you. You have to be able to discern what time period that this particular book is actually writing to. And of course, if the author is writing a particular book for a particular time period, it's going to reinforce certain truths, but it's also going to be arguing against or intentionally discrediting other truths. Okay, so again, we talked about this with the book of Daniel. So in Daniel, it wants the reader to be faithful to God and to wait for God to come and to vindicate. It doesn't want the readers to join up with the Maccabean forces and to take up swords and to fight. It also doesn't want them to compromise their Jewish faith and to just give up their Judaism completely. Okay. So it's not just what they're saying, it's also kind of what they're not saying. And, that requires a level of close reading and sophistication to do. Okay. And of course, it's a lot easier when you're doing these studies together as a group or, with your spouse or collectively in a Bible study community. A Bible study was always intended to be done in community. When you do it by yourself, sometimes you're going to miss some of these details. Okay. Number two, since heroes and prophets generally act virtuously, ask yourself what sort of values are being highlighted. That's important. Okay. Again, if they are heroes because they're acting a particular way, or if God has selected them to be his spokesperson because of their behavior, then that behavior is at least worth considering if you're a reader. Number three, consider larger themes in the story and how those larger themes are going to affect the overall narrative of the book. Okay, so again, this is you reading this particular piece of narrative in the context of the larger story. Okay, so that, of course, requires you to have a good understanding of what that larger story has been doing up to this particular point. Okay, now these themes could include election, as in how God is working with his people, conquest, whether it's conquest of the land or conquest of a foreign nation, apostasy, falling away, people being unfaithful, and the rise or the fall of a particular people group. Okay. So depending on your story, if you're reading Genesis, you're going to see a lot about the rise of a particular people group, the growing and growing and growing of the family and the seed given to Abraham, promised to Abraham. But of course, if you're reading Second Kings, you're going to see the eventual fall of this particular people group as Second Kings ends with the Babylonian exile. Okay. So that, of course, is a larger theme involved throughout the entirety of the book. And so when you're reading these individual pieces of narrative, ask how that is going to fit into the larger theme. Okay. All right. Time for comedy. Okay. So this is not the sort of comedies that we tend to think of today. And a lot of people are surprised that comedy actually is a subgenre of Old Testament narrative. But yes, it does appear. Okay. But let's define our terms because, this was around a lot longer before we had comedy specials on Netflix. Okay. So in the Old Testament, a comedy is, here's the definition, it's a narrative with a happy ending, often possessing a dramatic reversal. Okay. So that's interesting. Okay. So comedy is intended to, give the reader an ending that is satisfying. Okay. They will possess amusing elements sometimes, not always, but sometimes. Okay. But the main feature includes disguises. The main character will disguise his or her face or identity. That will, of course, lead to a mistaken identity on the part of the person disguised. Coincidences, which, of course, you have to read very carefully to see. Surprising turn of events. Usually that's part of the dramatic reversal. Escapes from disaster. Again, dramatic reversal. And of course, the triumphal overcoming of trials. Okay. Comedies are pretty sophisticated pieces of narrative. Okay. They are going to conclude with positive elements. And these positive elements usually include a wedding, okay, a feast, reconciliation with the antagonist, or just general victory over the enemies. Okay. So some of the common Old Testament comedies are going to include the entirety of the book of Esther. Okay. If you know the book of Esther, you can see, okay, well, what does this deal with? We know it has a happy ending. Okay. We know there's a dramatic reversal. Okay. We know that there are surprising turn of events. There's an escape from disaster. There's an overcoming of trials. Okay. We know that there's a wedding. We know there's a feast. We know that there's victory over enemies. I mean, this checks a lot of boxes. Okay. And a lot of people haven't really figured out what they're supposed to do with the book of Esther. Okay. And yet it's got a lot of functions in the Old Testament canon. But I think reading it as a comedy, excuse me, is a good way to consider it. Okay. The interaction between Jacob and Laban in 3 chapters in Genesis. So this, of course, is going to break apart our subgenre of the ancestral epic. Okay, that of course has some interesting turn of events, dramatic reversal, and a happy ending. The life of Joseph. That's chapters 37 through 50. When I talked about earlier about the final chapters of Genesis, with the first part, chapters 1 through 11, that's the cosmic epic. And then chapters 12 through 36, that's the ancestral epic. And so notice the last part is a comedy. Did you think that 1/3 of the book of Genesis could be considered a comedy? And again, look at the life of Joseph. Okay. Does that have a happy ending? Yes. Is there a dramatic reversal? Yes. Okay. Uh, are there disguises? Absolutely. I mean, he disguised himself as someone, so his brothers don't see him. Mistaken identity. Yes. Coincidences. Yes. Surprising turn of events. Yes. Escapes from disaster. Absolutely. And the overcoming of trials. Yeah. Does he reconcile with the antagonist? Yes. I mean, the life of Joseph is one of the premier comedies in the Old Testament. And yet most of us didn't know that because we, have kind of our modern idea of what a comedy is. Okay. Balaam and the donkey. Again, read that story, go through the checklist, and you're going to see, yeah, that's most certainly a comedy in the Old Testament. The book of Ruth, also short book of Ruth, 4 chapters. Going to have a happy ending, dramatic reversal in many of these particular points. The story of Jonah, again, short, 4 chapters, almost certainly a comedy, ends with a surprising turn of events. Okay. That's surprising, even to Jonah himself. Okay. This is a part of narrative. Okay. But it's a very sophisticated subgenre in Old Testament narrative, and it's got some very particular points. Some of them could be long. Again, life of Joseph. Okay. Some could be rather short. The life of Balaam and the donkey. Okay. So, what are some tips or principles for interpreting Old Testament comedies? Okay. Follow carefully the details in the story that move the narrative from tragedy to triumph. Okay. If you know that a comedy is going to end with the triumph and the victory of the main character, then follow those details because that's how the author is forming and writing and organizing the story. Yeah, it's going to have a low point, but it's going to end in a good way, and look very carefully at the steps in which the author is going to place and organize a story that move from the low end to the high end. Consider the development of the key characters. Okay. The characters are not going to be static to where they kind of act the same way, think the same way, do the same thing. The main characters, the protagonist, they're going to develop, they're going to move in a positive direction. But if there are antagonists, if there are enemies, then they're typically going to move in a negative direction. Okay. If you think of the main characters in the story of Esther, you can see certain persons that, of course, have positive character development and also negative character development. Number 3, discern what role God plays in the story. Okay. And the role that God plays in comedies may be explicit and might just be explicitly stated there, or it could be subtly implicit. Okay. If you think to yourself about this, think about, the biggest comedy, which of course is the life of Joseph. God is kind of absent from the story, at least, he's not like out there in the open. He's not appearing to Joseph. He's not talking to him. He's in the background. It's kind of implicit, but the promises that were already made earlier in Genesis that were made to Abraham, and to his family. I'm going to bless those that bless you, and those that curse you, I'm going to curse, and all the families of the earth are going to be blessed in you and in your family. All of those themes continue to happen through the life of Joseph, even though God is not explicitly mentioned very much at all in that particular story. Okay. Like Esther, God is hardly mentioned at all. Okay. But it's very clear that the story indicates the preservation of the Jewish people in a way that, of course, furthers the intentions of God. Okay. So in comedies, discern if God is actively present there in the story? And if he's not, what is he doing behind the scenes? What is he implicitly doing? Because obviously God is active in these stories, but is it something that's out there in the open in the front, or is it something there in the background? And what function might the author be giving to God implicitly working subtly in the background? Okay, that's an important point for you to consider. Number 4, if the comedy is part of a larger work, okay, again, think of Joseph, okay, consider how the message of the comedy helps shape the overarching story, okay? Included in this consideration should be an assessment of how God guided, preserved, or made promises to the subject of the comedy. I already said that earlier about how God had made promises to the ancestors of Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, that, of course, helps to implicitly guide or shape the story, and it helps to preserve Joseph. Okay? So, comedies, I think, are a neglected part of Old Testament narrative, and hopefully you'll be able to walk away from this being able to recognize them when they show up, because I didn't even give you an exhaustive list. I just gave you kind of the major ones, and you'll be able to read them with a little bit more attention to detail. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the farewell speech. As you might imagine, a farewell speech is the last thing that you say before you die. Okay. It's the final address given by a dying person, usually to his children, to his successors, or to an entire nation. Okay. And it is given in the first person voice, even though the author has probably been telling the entire story or writing the entire book in the third person. And the farewell speech is going to encourage the listeners to live in a certain way. Okay. The role of those listening to the farewell speeches is to be followed in order to discern how the narrator develops those parting words of wisdom. Okay. So, what I mean by this is that you're going to have a particular figure. Let's just take Jacob. At the end of Jacob's life, he summons his 12 sons and he gives a farewell speech to each of the 12 sons. Okay. The one that's important theologically is, of course, what's given to Judah in Genesis 49, verse 8 through 10, but that's just one out of the 12 that he gives. And so it's not only important to look at the contents of the farewell speech, but look at the things that are said in that speech to the recipient and how that recipient goes on and lives out their life in light of what's actually being said. Okay. Does the narrator characterize the recipient of the speech in accordance to what was actually said by the person that's dying? Do they live faithfully to that particular commissioning, or are they unfaithful to it? Okay. That's an important thing that you kind of want to consider. And that's, again, part of you, juggling a lot of different balls in the air at the same time as you're looking at things really from a 30,000-foot view. The best examples of farewell speeches in the Old Testament would be, of course, Jacob talking to his sons in Genesis 49, Moses talking to Israel, which covers basically 2 chapters in Deuteronomy, and then like the first part of chapter 31. So again, Moses commissions Israel to be faithful and to obey. And so again, the question is, okay, after you get done with Deuteronomy and you go to Joshua and you go to Judges and you go to 1st, 2nd Samuel, are they being faithful to the words of Moses? That's an interesting question. Okay. Joshua talking to Israel again. This is kind of very similar to Moses doing it. Samuel, before he dies, talking to Israel. We do know that Samuel has, in some sense, a post-mortem conversation with Saul, with the Witch of Endor, which is a really odd and interesting passage. And of course, there's a rebuking that takes place there. David, right before he dies, he talks to Solomon, his son, and tells him what he's supposed to do. And this, of course, it gets recounted at the beginning of First Kings, which is like right before David dies. But also there's a kind of poetic version of it in 2nd Samuel, right before David dies. Okay. So you might have thought that farewell speeches are just like a normal part of the narrative, but actually they are their own specific piece of subgenre within the narrative sections. Okay. So, what are some tips and principles for interpreting farewell speeches? Number one, ask the question why the speaker gave the contents of his speech and what surrounding circumstances or narrative themes have impacted that particular speech. Okay. Are these particular ideals and truths and promises that Jacob has been told his entire life by his father, Isaac, and of course by his grandfather, Abraham? And is he passing those on to his children? Again, don't just look specifically at what's being said there. What sort of themes or circumstances are feeding into the contents of these final farewell speeches, the final words and testaments. Number two, consider carefully how the audience of the speech is to act and behave in light of the contents of the speech. I already alluded to this already. Do the hearers act in accordance with the speech, or do they deviate from its wisdom? Okay. Sometimes the authors are going to start characterizing the recipients of the speech in light of what was actually said, either in a way of showing that they're being faithful to what they were told or being unfaithful to that. But the author is going to keep that in mind. So you, as the reader, also need to keep that in mind. Number three, examine how the speech develops and foreshadows wider themes in the overarching story. Okay, so are they going to develop things that have already been said? And are they foreshadowing things that are going to come up in maybe the following chapter or subsequent chapters? Okay. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. Okay. All right. Now we're going to look at what are called embedded genres in the Old Testament narratives. These are going to be much, much smaller, but they could also be parsed out as different types of embedded genres. Okay, so they're going to be in a piece of Old Testament narrative, but they're going to be much, much smaller. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is the popular proverb. The popular proverb. Popular proverbs are well-known sayings about everyday people or events. And by everyday people or events, that means in the context of course, the narrative that's being written and the lives of the original audience. Okay. They might not be well known to us, which is probably why we read over most of these popular proverbs, because we don't think that they're about our everyday events. So, of course, we have the book of Proverbs, which is a collection of these popular proverbs, but they also appear in narrative portions of the Old Testament. Okay. So this one gets repeated in 1 Samuel. The question is Saul also among the prophets? Because King Saul was someone that was given the Spirit, and he has these sort of ecstatic trance experiences in a way that's not characteristic of some of the other kings of Israel. So, of course, it actually says that there's this saying that was going around, is Saul also among the prophets? Okay. It's repeated a couple of times, but the way that gets introduced indicates that it is a popular proverb or was a popular proverb. Okay. Here's an interesting one that we might not think is a popular proverb. Blessed is so-and-so, or blessed be so-and-so. Okay. This will appear in a variety of places, but that's a popular proverb. Okay. And on the other hand, of course, cursed be so-and-so, or cursed is this particular person. Okay. Those are popular proverbs. All right. From evildoers come evil deeds. That sounds like a popular proverb, and you know what? You could still use that today. It appears in 1 Samuel 24. Okay. The days go by and every vision comes to nothing. Okay. That's the sort of thing that you could see would be repeated in this sort of pessimistic outlook during the life of Ezekiel. Okay. Days just go on and all the visions don't really amount to anything. So that's a sad popular proverb. Okay. Like mother, like daughter. Okay. That's mentioned there in Ezekiel. Again, popular proverb. Okay. So that's just one of the embedded genres within the Old Testament narrative. Okay. The next three we're just going to kind of condense into a single slide. The riddle, the fable, and the parable. These are probably fairly common to most readers of the Bible, but I want to make sure that we are putting this out here because maybe they're new to you. Okay. What is a riddle? Okay. A riddle is a clever, simple statement whose hidden meaning must be uncovered. And the most common riddle in the Old Testament is the riddle that Samson gave at a particular wedding. Okay. But the Queen of Sheba is said that she showed up to King Solomon and she gave King Solomon a bunch of riddles. Now, it doesn't tell us how Solomon answered it, but we know from the story that earlier in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon, instead of praying for a bunch of money, he prayed for wisdom and God gave him wisdom and he gave him a bunch of money. And so Solomon had the wisdom and he was able to answer, of course, these riddles. Okay. All right. A fable. Okay. Fable is, technically speaking, it's a brief story that has moral purposes involving plants or animals that act like people. Okay. That's the key thing about a fable. It has to be an animal or a plant that's acting like people. Okay. So here's an example in Judges chapter 9. Jotham told, or he spoke about how trees sought a king among the trees and the vines, but they only found a thorn bush. Okay. And you could read between the lines, say, oh, some people were looking for a king among a bunch of really nice kings, but they only found something that was terrible and bad for them. Okay. But you can see there's plants. Okay. Uh, there's another one in Second Kings, and even Ezekiel is going to mention one because Ezekiel has narrative portions and it also has prophetic portions as well. Okay. Uh, when you have animals or plants, you might actually make the argument that the fable can overlap with prophetic visions when the Old Testament prophets are going to see visions or have dreams of various nations being described as animals. Okay. So the vision in Daniel chapter 7 is a good example to where you have a vision of a lion, you have a vision of a bear, you have the vision of a leopard, and you have a great and terrible, awful beast. Okay. But it's clear that they are described as nations. Okay. So prophecies could also contain fable elements. Okay. Parable. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you know what a parable is. It's a brief comparative story involving human characters. Okay. That's kind of the major distinction between a fable and a parable. Fables deal with plants and animals that act like people. Parables deal with humans. Okay. Although they are less frequent in the Old Testament than the frequency that we see Jesus using parables in the 4 New Testament Gospels, they are significant when they show up. Most famous parable is when Nathan, the prophet, convicts King David about the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 12. And the parable of the vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7 is also really memorable. I actually think that's one of the most theologically important ones because it gets quoted or alluded to in the New Testament several times in a way that I think is really important. Okay. So I think the Nathan parable is the most memorable, but I think the most theologically significant one is the parable of the vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5. There are a variety of them also in the book of Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes is able to have parables contained within it. Okay. So you can see there's some pretty clear distinctions between riddles, fables, and parables. But I'm pretty sure that if you were to read through them in the Old Testament, you would discern, okay, yeah, I see this. I could recognize this. This is not too difficult to discern. Okay. Songs and dirges. Okay. Basically, the distinction here is that a song is just anything that's sung. A dirge is a sad song. Okay. So, not all songs are dirges, but all dirges are songs. Okay. So, a song was part of the daily life of Israel. They were singing all the time. Okay. It was pretty common in their culture. Okay. It was actually called the Song of a Well, which was basically a song that workers would sing when they were digging wells. Okay. According to 2 verses in Numbers chapter 21. Okay. Some of the more famous songs would be the Song of the Sea, which celebrate Yahweh's victory over Egypt in Exodus chapter 15. It's famous because the grammarians of the Hebrew Bible think that the Hebrew contained in the Song of the Sea is some of the oldest Hebrew that we actually have. The other one that's significant would be the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, which, of course, celebrates God's victory over the Canaanite king Jabin. Okay, that also is a very old piece of Hebrew. Okay, there are other songs in Exodus, Numbers, Second Kings, and even Jonah, while he's inside a whale, is singing a song. Okay, of course, we have the book of Psalms, which were all sung aloud, something that we don't typically do. But it was, again, it just shows that singing was a pretty common part of the life of an Israelite. Okay. A dirge, on the other hand, was a funeral song sung for a beloved lost family member. It could be also for a friend. Okay. The famous person who wrote and sung dirges would be David. Okay. They often start off with the characteristic how, how did this take place, or how, the life of this particular person continued. Okay, so that's a common theme that you can see. If you go through and you look at these, you'll notice that's a common reoccurring theme that tells you that, hey, a dirge is taking place. Okay, in Hebrew, they're easier to see because they have, a kind of a repetition of the number 5, but that's almost impossible to bring out into English. So dirges are very, very specific literary pieces. So David sings a dirge when Saul and Jonathan die at the beginning of 2 Samuel. He's going to sing a dirge when Abner dies in 2 Samuel chapter 3, and it gets repeated at the end of 2 Chronicles. And they also appear in the prophetic material, like Ezekiel chapter 27 and chapter 32. There are entire chapters that are dedicated to dirges. And some scholars actually think that the book of Lamentations, which like never gets preached on, hardly ever gets quoted, but it's there. It's a long lament over the destruction of the temple, told from the perspective of Jeremiah. That, of course, is going to be seen by some people as a dirge. There are some scholars that don't think that technically it's a dirge, but it's something to kind of consider. You might want to put Lamentations under that umbrella, but I'm just kind of telling it to you with an asterisk over it. Okay. Okay, so let's move to list. Okay, this might be boring to you, okay, but guess what? Lists are a pretty common embedded piece within Old Testament narratives. What do? They recount things, names or items that have some sort of shared characteristics, okay? Spoils of war are listed as list, okay? Offerings that are pledged towards the building of something are going to be in a list, okay? Sometimes cities and towns are just going to be listed out over a variety of chapters, like there in Joshua chapters 15 through 19. Names of mercenaries can be listed out, and names of royal officials could also be listed out in 1 Kings chapter 4 over a variety of verses. Okay, so yeah, lists could be over anything, whether important or mundane, but yeah, they're there. Okay, now the most common list, at least I don't want to say the most common, but the most theologically significant list that I think often just gets skimmed over by readers are genealogies. Genealogies, I know a lot of people have told me they are boring. They're boring. It's just a list of names. Why do these names matter? Well, they matter because they're not just a list of names. They're the list of people in the retelling of the story of the people of God. And so a list of names is going to be important for that history that God is involved in, because he's involved in this history dealing with a called group of people. Okay, so I came up with 4 particular points of note involving the importance of genealogies. So genealogies establish and preserve the lineage and identity of individuals and tribes. Okay, so they're going to confirm the tribal affiliations. any inheritance rights that they might have, and family connections, which of course are crucial to the ancient Israelite society. And of course, when you have a genealogy, they're going to help us construct a general timeline of biblical history. Something you should know about genealogies is that they're almost always not complete. They will tend to leave out persons in genealogies, especially if those persons are bad eggs, or the people in our families that we don't like to talk about Uncle so and so, that's got some skeletons in the closet. Ancient people felt the same way. So genealogies are hardly ever complete. That's why I think that they can help you put together a timeline, but not a specific one. It should be a general timeline. So there should always be a little bit of care involved in reconstructing those things. Number two, genealogies highlight the fulfillment of divine promises and covenants. That's important. So, of course, if God made a covenant with Abraham, okay, that his family, his descendants, are going to bless the world, they're going to inherit the land. Then, of course, genealogies that trace the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Judah, and all throughout that family tree, that's important. That shows the promises of God. It shows the covenants. Of course, the Davidic covenant, that the descendants of David are going to occupy the throne forever. That's important. That's why Matthew begins with this massive genealogy. And that's why Luke also is going to have that genealogy after talking about the baptism of Jesus. Number three, genealogies sometimes have symbolic or theological meanings, such as the repeated phrase, to the 10th generation. Number 10 would emphasize some sort of number of completeness or divine order. We know Matthew's genealogy is composed with 14 generations here, 14 generations here, 14 generations, and of course, 14 is just multiples of 7, which of course is another number of completeness. God created the heaven and the earth in 7 days. Okay. Genealogies, lastly, they help to establish legal and social rights related to inheritance and land ownership. Okay. They're going to clarify the legitimate heirs to property and leadership positions in the community. And in dealing with the tabernacle or the temple, they also are going to identify the priestly and the Levitical families, ensuring that the sacred roles involved with priestly functions are going to be performed by the appropriate descendants. Okay. That's an interesting point to consider, how the father of John the Baptist was a priest, but John the Baptist himself decided he didn't want to be a priest. And he actually started to offer forgiveness in places outside of where the Jerusalem temple was. So it's interesting to see how he kind of deviated from what was expected, that, if your dad was a priest, you were going to be a priest. So that's something interesting about John the Baptist that it gets overlooked. So examples of it, there's also one in Genesis 5. So Genesis 5, Genesis 10, Genesis 22. The last part of Ruth helps to connect Ruth with David. And then really the first part of First Chronicles really just begins with the genealogy. And that's why people just kind of skim over them. They move through them because they think it's boring, but they weren't boring to the original readers. As you could see, they had several really key and important functions for the people and for how God was working with this people. Okay, so talked about a lot of different embedded genres. What are some of the tips or principles for interpreting these embedded genres? Okay, and yes, this is the final slide for today. Okay, so number one, embedded genres function as a complement to the entire book. Okay, so assessing how they serve the bigger picture is crucial. Again, so you have to look at that genre and look at the bigger picture and say, okay, how does this piece of the puzzle fit into the larger picture? So how do you do this? First, define the main purpose of the embedded piece, whether it's a parable or whether it's a fable or whether it's a genealogy. Okay, what is its purpose here individually? And then consider its relationship to the entire book. Okay, that's just a good basic step for really reading anything. Number three, consider potential literary functions these smaller portions might have. Okay, how can they move the narrative along? How are they supporting and building upon the major themes that have gone before? Okay, that's key and important. part. Okay. And okay, that's the last point. Okay. It's also worth considering whether these embedded pieces foreshadow or anticipate parts of the narrative that are still to come. Okay. So, of course, that means you have to understand what they're doing and then kind of look and anticipate whether other parts are going to take place. Okay. So, to me, I think that's a pretty thorough running through of the Old Testament narrative, again, which is 40%. Narrative is 40% of the Old Testament. It is a particular piece of literary genre in the same way that in our newspaper today, we have the front page, we have the sports page, we have the comics, we have the classifieds, we have the obituaries, we have the political cartoons. Those are different pieces of genre in a particular newspaper. The Bible is going to have different pieces of genre. The biggest piece of genre is narrative. Okay. And even in narrative, as you're seeing, it's pretty nuanced. There are subgenres, there are embedded genres. Okay. And so hopefully this has informed us to read those with a little bit more care, a little bit more discernment, maybe to recognize them when we've been just reading over them without thinking that they're particularly special. And hopefully we can get some more out of the text by doing so. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording, stop sharing my screen. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, if you want to read or hear the other examples, just look in the playlist where you're watching this. There'll be a playlist, and you can see the previous 6 sessions. And of course, once a month, we do other sections of hermeneutics. Next month, we will go through law, the genre of law that basically is in Exodus, Deuteronomy, but that's what we're going to be looking at next. Okay. Thanks for watching and take care.